back, and great to see you all. Thanks for coming. I've spent much of my philosophical life thinking about probability and counterfactuals. Now I find myself turning more and more to moral philosophy. And I'm realizing more and more just how central to it are issues in probability and counterfactuals. And today I want to present some of those issues. According to a standard statement of consequentialism, a morally right action is one that has the best consequences. And more generally, given a choice between two actions, one is morally better than the other, just in case the consequences of the former are better than those of the latter. And these are not just the immediate consequences of the actions, but long-term consequences, perhaps until the end of time. Now, this account glides easily off the tongue, so easily that one may not notice that on one understanding, it literally makes no sense. And that on another understanding, it has a startling, I would say, metaphysical presupposition concerning counterfactuals. And I'll bring this presupposition into relief. Objective consequentialism has faced various objections, including so-called cluelessness. We have no idea what most of the consequences of our actions will be. I think that objective consequentialism has a far worse problem. Its very foundations are dubious. And even granting those foundations, a worse problem than cluelessness remains. I'll call it clumsiness. And I think these problems quickly generalise to a number of other moral theories. I'd be delighted to just take down all moral theorising today. Maybe not quite that ambitious. The points are most easily made for objective consequentialism. I'll focus mostly on it. And I'll consider three ways that it might be improved. First, appeal instead to not too specific short-term consequences of actions. Second, understand consequences with objective probabilities, not counterfactuals. Three, understand consequences with subjective or evidential probabilities. The principle of indifference might be regarded as an evidential probability constraint on rational agents' credences. Graves argues that it solves an important class of cluelessness cases. I disagree. I'll briefly consider another constraint on rational credences, an objective probability constraint, the principle, and I'll end with my own positive proposal for how we should formulate consequentialism, arguing that it solves, or at least considerably mitigates, all of these problems. If you're following along on the handout, we are up to the beginning, actual counterfactual consequences. Driver writes, consequentialism is the view that the moral quality of an action, for example, the rightness of the action, is completely determined by the action's consequences relative to the consequences of alternative actions open to the agent. Graves writes, this is how she characterises objective consequentialism. A1 is objectively C better than A2 if and only if the consequences of A1 are better than those of A2. C better is her term of art for the comparison that will matter to the consequentialist. Now, this implies that both A1 and A2 have consequences. Such statements of consequentialism are entirely familiar, but do they make sense? So consider a moral choice that you face. You could help an old lady across the street, or you could go to the pub. Let's suppose that in fact you help the old lady. Did you do the right thing? Now, I'm happy enough to allow that there's a fact of the matter of the total value of the consequences of your action. But what about the thing that you did not do? You did not go to the pub. How good are its consequences? So I say, taken literally, this does not make sense. There are no consequences of an action that is not performed. So immediately we encounter a problem with the very statement of objective consequentialism and its generalisation, comparing one act to another. I say they don't make sense, as stated so far. At a given choice, you actually perform only one action, so only it has consequences. So it seems the statement should instead involve counterfactual actions and the consequences they would have if they were performed. And I think this is the most charitable understanding. Or we might stipulate a technical usage of consequences which builds in their counterfactuality by fiat. And decision theory sometimes employs such a technical notion of consequences. Anyway, let's just say it more carefully. A morally right action is one that would have the best consequences if it were performed. And for example, on the handout, there's Tanzio's statement of utilitarianism. An action is right if and only if, in the situation, there was no alternative to it which would have resulted in a greater sum total of welfare in the world. So now we'll be explicit about the counterfactual. And given a choice between two actions, one's morally better than another, just in case the consequences of the former action, if it were performed, would be better than those of the latter, if it were performed. Okay, again, this glides off the tongue all too easily, I claim. Now again, I think there's an underappreciated but fatal problem, and I'll develop the problem in two ways, depending on whether the world is indeterministic or deterministic at the time at which the choice of action takes place. We are up to indeterminism. Okay, first let's assume that the world is indeterministic thereafter. And indeed that seems rather plausible. It seems that the world has myriad chancy processes, such as coin tosses, lotteries, various natural processes, not to mention quantum mechanical events. Focus on an action that you did not perform. So in this case, going to the pub. You did not go to the pub. Merely hypothetical. Well, if you had gone to the pub, how would the first non-actual chance process thereafter have turned out? So to fix our ideas, let it be the first non-actual coin toss thereafter. Well, if you'd gone to the pub, the coin would have landed heads, not tails, right? That was a joke. Good. And I want you to laugh. I want you to be... I claim this is an implausible statement, and perhaps even laughable, because after all, if the coin had been tossed, it might have landed... Sorry, it would have landed tails. How about that one? Is it just as bad? Right, good. Keep laughing, because I find these counterfactuals laughably implausible. Now, consider the undermining might not counterfactuals. If the coin had been tossed, it might not have landed heads, it might have landed tails. It might not have landed tails, it might have landed heads. And I maintain that the truth of these might nots entails the falsehood of the corresponding woulds. So just try saying out loud, if you'd gone to the pub, the coin might not have landed heads, but it would have landed heads. Ouch, right? So I think that's a semantic ouch, the ouch of contradiction. And we could discuss that. Maybe it's pragmatic. It's certainly an ouch. I don't actually need the detour through mights. It's really the chanciness that's doing the work. The might not argument is just a quick way to sort of summarize the point. And I want you to hear the might and the might nots ontically rather than epistemically. They represent a potentiality in the world. They're not merely some agent's uncertainty. All right, now while I disagree with the usual Lewis-style semantics for counterfactuals involving most similar worlds, it's a useful heuristic that helps me just convey my point quickly. Okay, so on this approach, if it were that P, it would be that Q is true just in case all the most similar P worlds are Q. All the most similar P worlds are Q. Okay? Among the most similar worlds in which you go to the pub, some are heads worlds and some are tails worlds, I say. They're not unanimous either way. So it's false that the coin would have landed heads, and false that it would have landed tails. Right? Could have gone either way. Or consider the first non-actual lottery to be played after your non-actual trip to the pub. And suppose it would have had some large number of tickets, numbered 1, 2, 3, etc. If you'd gone to the pub, ticket number 17 would have won. That's another of my jokes. And it remains a joke whichever number is singled out as the winner, rather than some other. So I say, for any ticket, it's false that that ticket would have won, if you'd gone to the pub. It might not have. Now, it's important here not to be seduced by the trivial truth. If you'd gone to the pub, there would have been a winning ticket. What I find implausible is the wide-scope existential claim. There is a particular ticket such that it would have been the winner if you'd gone to the pub, as it might be ticket number 17 and no other. Or in similarity of worlds speak, the most similar worlds in which you go to the pub do not all agree on which ticket wins. You know, ticket number 17 gets represented, but so do all the other tickets. On the handout, I say that the counterfactuals are false, but an important alternative view says that they're indeterminate. Stalnaker thinks that there's always a unique, most similar, closest antecedent world, but in cases like this, it's indeterminate what it is. Okay, so I don't want to insist that the relevant counterfactuals are false. It suffices that Stalnaker and I can agree the counterfactuals are not true. And indeed, Stalnaker can laugh at them with me. For him, it's rather like laughing at Sherlock Holmes had an even number of hairs, not odd, at Reichenbach Falls. No. Now that's indeterminate according to a popular view about truth in fiction. And indeterminacy is problematic enough for objective consequentialists to the extent they're committed to there being facts of the matter of the counterfactuals. Or, I mean, maybe they could think there's just rampant indeterminacy about whether a given action is morally better than another in almost all cases. But really, it's a huge bullet to bite. Look, it's often platitudinous what the right verdict is. It's true that donating to Oxfam is better than going on a serial killing rampage. But please don't tell me it's indeterminate, right? No. And on another influential view about counterfactuals, this is inspired by Ramsey, developed by Adams, Edgington. The counterfactuals do not have truth values, they do have probabilities. Now again, these authors and I can agree that the consequentialist counterfactuals are not true. And again, the verdict that it's not true, that it's better for you to donate to Oxfam than to go on a serial killing rampage, should be condemned roundly. But I have barely begun. There's recently been a cottage industry of observing just how significant an effect on subsequent history our actions have, even mundane or trivial actions. They have ripple effects, and they're not merely like the ripples on a pond caused by a stone's throw, which dampen down and quickly disappear. Now, on the contrary, the ripple effects of our actions are ongoing and amplify. Our actions affect the identities of future people for the rest of history. These identities depend on the fine details of which sperm happens to fertilize which egg on particular occasions, changing the details of the nature of the conceptions and hence the identities of the children that are subsequently born. So, for example, a tiny change in your action may just slightly delay the moment of a conception. And that's enough to change the identity of that future child. Parfit makes much of this, Graves makes much of this. So it's plausible that such conceptions are yet more chance events, more lotteries in a broad sense. So, if you'd gone to the pub, consider the first non-actual child to be conceived thereafter. I say it's false of any particular sperm that it would have won its race to an egg. It's lottery. False that this child would have been conceived rather than some other. But I've still barely begun. So now consider that hypothetical child's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and so on for the rest of history. Consider all the non-actual people's interactions with these hypothetical descendants and all their hypothetical descendants' interactions, blah, blah, blah. I find it implausible there's a truth of how all of these chance events would have turned out if you'd gone to the pub. And it's even less plausible that there's a truth of what the magnitudes and durations would have been of all the joys and sorrows of all these non-existent people, or whatever else counts as consequences. After all, these depend on the resolutions of yet more chance processes. The true counterfactuals are simply not that precise. Now, there's a lot to say about this. We can have a whole session just on what I've said now. Hold the thought. We can all agree that for any action you might perform, there's a strongest true proposition concerning what would have happened. Now, according to one view, I'll call it an extreme view, this proposition is as strong as a single world, singleton set of a single world. The objective consequentialism that I've been considering, and I take it to be quite standard, need not be that extreme, but it's, I find, still implausibly close to that extreme, committed to implausibly strong claims about what would have happened. And again, it had better not settle for rampant indeterminacy. According to another extreme view at the other end of the spectrum, the strongest true proposition is no stronger than a necessary proposition. I think the true view is a moderate one that lies somewhere in between these extremes. And in particular, while this strongest proposition may resolve various matters, it does not resolve the outcome of a chance process, at least when the chances are nowhere near 0 and 1. And in the cases I'm imagining, that's how it is. On the handout. For example, suppose a psychopath contemplates hooking up a doomsday device to be activated if a particular fair coin landed heads, but not if the coin landed tails. What would happen if he were to perform this action? Well, I say it's not the case that billions of people would die. They might not. Each scenario happening with chance 1/2. Objective consequentialism formulated counterfactually fails to capture the wrongness of the action. In fixating on what would happen, this consequentialism neglects what might happen and, more importantly, the associated chances. This poses a dilemma for objective consequentialism formulated counterfactually. If it adopts a moderate view about how strong the true counterfactuals are, I believe it should, then it'll go silent in many chancy cases where it should speak and even shout from the rooftops. If it adopts an extreme view, as I believe it standardly does, then it's committed to, I say, implausibly precise counterfactuals. On the former horn, its ethics is compromised. On the latter horn, its metaphysics is compromised. Let's pursue the latter horn further, and that brings us to determinism. So far I've been assuming indeterminism after your pub jaunt. Now let's assume determinism, which you might think is the best hope for objective consequentialism. So now, given a precise specification of the initial conditions and the laws of nature, we get an entire history determined thereafter. From a snapshot of the world at the time of your choice of going to the pub, the rest of what happens in the world lawfully follows. Okay, now it might seem more plausible that there's a truth of what would have happened for the rest of history if you'd gone to the pub. But now a different problem kicks in. The unspecificity of the antecedent. If you'd gone to the pub, somehow or other, well, how exactly? Now I find it implausible that there's a particular way that this loosely specified antecedent would be realised. If you'd gone to the pub, you would have entered it at 6:03 p.m, 24 seconds and 17 milliseconds. That was another joke. No, because after all, you would have entered at 6:03, 24 and 18 milliseconds. No, stop. It's another joke. I'm drawing attention, I hope, to the implausibility of these counterfactuals. They hitch together an inexact antecedent with an all too exact consequent. They're implausibly specific. If you'd gone to the pub, you might not have entered at 6:03, 24 seconds and 17 milliseconds. So it's false that you would have done so. And so it goes for any putative exact entry time. Or said in Lewisian terms, the most similar pub worlds do not all agree on your exact arrival time. But yet again, I've barely begun. I'm going to say that a lot. There's no truth of who the first non-actual child to have been conceived would have been, no truth of which sperm would have fertilized which egg if you'd gone to the pub somehow or other, and so on, for the subsequent non-actual lineage of this non-actual child and all the non-actual people with whom they would interact, and so on. Okay, now an objective consequentialist might reply, they need not commit to a specific counterfactual history if you'd pubbed. A range of counterfactual histories is fine as long as the total value of their consequences is sufficiently delimited. And let's even draw a picture of that. So maybe it's like this, that up here is you're helping the old lady and the value of that. And now consider all of the ways you could go to the pub and the consequences thereafter. Let's suppose they're all down here. You know, here are better ones, here are worse ones, but they're all below helping the old lady. Well then, it doesn't matter how the chips fall. You did the right thing, helping the old lady. Well, that's a forlorn hope. Our everyday actions may have radically divergent effects on the total values of subsequent histories. This is bread and butter for the cottage industry. In one hypothetical history after your hypothetical pubbing, the children that happen to be conceived are a series of latter-day Buddhas and Einsteins, and a wonderful world ensues. And with just a tiny tweak to the details of your pubbing, we get another hypothetical scenario in which the children that are conceived are latter-day Hitlers and Stalins. And with other tweaks, we get a broad spectrum of outcomes, filling in, you know, the gaps between. Now, some of these scenarios are comparable in total value to what's actually realized by your helping the old lady. Some are much worse, some are much better. So there aren't even moderate bounds on the total value that would have resulted if you'd gone to the pub. There's no truth of whether helping the old lady was better or worse. Yet as before, the details make all the difference, as it might be if you'd entered the pub at the 17 millisecond time, a series of moral saints and geniuses would have been created. But if you'd entered at the 18 millisecond time, a series of moral monsters and charlatans would have been conceived. Well, there's acute sensitivity to the exact initial conditions of the value of what follows thereafter. So even under determinism, with an unspecific starting point, there's no fact of that value, nor even moderate bounds on it. Instead, there's a vast portfolio of live possibilities regarding what it might be. The exact details make a world of difference. We get huge world differences. Okay, as I've been understanding objective consequentialism, it's committed to the truth of a staggering set, I say, of counterfactuals concerning the consequences of non-actual actions. I say that such counterfactuals are false. Followers of Stornacker say they're indeterminate. Followers of Adams and Edgington say they just lack a truth value. Anyway, they're not true. Such counterfactuals had better not be the foundation of morality. We are up to cluelessness and clumsiness. At this point, a consequentialist might reply, there is a truth of how exactly you would have entered the pub. The exact initial conditions associated with your pubbing, from which the rest of counterfactual history deterministically follows. So let's suppose this for the sake of the argument now. There's still a dire problem, I say, for objective consequentialism. The recent literature on objective consequentialism makes much of the so-called problem of cluelessness. We can never have the faintest idea which action would have the best consequences. I'm thinking of Lenman, Cowan, Birch-Brown, Graves, Mogensen. Let's suppose that your 17 millisecond arrival time would initiate a history rich with latter-day Buddhas and Einsteins. 18 millisecond arrival time would initiate one burdened with Hitlers and Stalins. And the problem is supposed to be that we could never know these facts or have justified belief in them. And that's an epistemic But this understates how bad the situation is for objective consequentialism. So suppose we could somehow solve the problem of cluelessness. Say God tells you these alleged facts. Then what? The trouble is it's simply not under your control to realise the conditions in one precise way rather than another. So much as you might want to arrive at the 17 millisecond time, God says, that's the good one. You can't so finely tune your actions so as to do so, rather than arriving at the 18 millisecond time. You're clumsy. When it comes to these extremely fine-grained actions, you're a klutz. So these exact arrival times are not genuine options for you. You can't decide to realise one rather than another. And the actions that consequentialism evaluates shouldn't be mere behaviours. I would want them to be options that you can decide among. What God tells you is not action guiding in a sense that I would care about. Now, as usual, I have barely begun. What would happen immediately after your arrival? Suppose that if you were to move your hands in exactly such and such a way for the next second, a Panglossian world would follow. But if you were to move them in an adjacent so-and-so way, a Painlossian world would follow. And you don't have such fine motor control over your hands to direct them one way rather than the other. And so it goes for the rest of your time in the pub, and so on. So on the handout, we can put this as another dilemma. I love dilemmas. Depending on how fine-grained the objects of moral evaluation are. First horn of the dilemma. Suppose they're somewhat coarse-grained things like, you go to the pub. Well, then it's plausible these really are options of yours, but it's not plausible that there's an entire counterfactual history uniquely determined thereafter, given the unspecificity of such options. Second horn of the dilemma. Suppose the objects of moral evaluation are precisely specified options, like you go to the pub at 6:03, 24 seconds and 17 milliseconds, not 18. Well then, maybe it's more plausible there's a truth of the entire counterfactual history thereafter. But it's not plausible that these options are things that you can decide among. They're not genuine options that you can deliberately realise or not as an act of your volition. Hence the scare quotes, or the air quotes. Your clumsiness renders you unable to realise one of these options rather than its near neighbours by an act of your will. Either way, objective consequentialism founders. We are up to, it's not just about you. But yet again, I've still barely begun. I've engaged in an act of pretense in order to convey a point, but the reality's worse. So far I've pretended that under determinism, an exact specification of your pubbing would determine a unique counterfactual history thereafter. And Graves explicitly endorses a generalisation of this thought. It's on the handout. Assume determinism. Then, for any given sufficiently precisely described act, A, there's a fact of the matter about which possible world would be realised. What the future course of history would be if I performed A. Well, that's not clear to me. For you're just a tiny part of the world. In the sweep of world history, you are just a speck. I'm sorry if this comes as news to you. So even describing precisely the details of your going to the pub, the millisecond of your arrival, your exact hand movements thereafter, that falls stupendously short of determining the entire world's initial conditions at that time. And under determinism, it's the initial conditions of the entire world and the laws that entail the rest of history. The initial conditions of a minuscule part of the world, such as the arrival of one person in a pub, doesn't even come close to being a sufficient input for such an entailment. After all, what's going on elsewhere would also play a huge role in determining the identities of the hypothetical people that we're supposed to imagine, and all of their interactions and so on. And never mind the people, don't forget about the hypothetical dogs and frogs and bees and trees and photons and electrons, right? So this is an even more dramatic version of the problem of unspecificity of the counterfactual's antecedent. To get an entire history to follow from the specification of initial conditions under determinism, you'd need to specify an entire time slice of history, not merely some tiny part of a portion of a fragment of a time slice of history, the details of your pub going. So even the exact specification of your pub going is just a minuscule sliver of the slice that's required. Now, previously I found it highly implausible. There's a fact of the matter of exactly how you would have entered the pub. 6:03 p.m, 24 seconds and 17 milliseconds. And other jokes. I didn't say they were good jokes. Objective consequentialism, a la Graves, is committed to something I find even more implausible, that if you'd gone to the pub, the entire world history would have been blank, and there's a unique way of filling in the blank. Your action would make a tiny contribution to the world history, given everything else that would be going on. So all the more I find it implausible that merely fixing your action, unspecifically at that, nails down the rest of history. And this is not a problem of cluelessness. It's not a problem that, gosh, it's hard to know that history. It's not merely an epistemic problem. It's a metaphysical problem. There's no particular history that would ensue, I say. Although, of course, this implies that there's nothing to know. The world itself is clueless. Graves had us assume determinism. That's arguably the best case for there always being a unique world that would be realised. And I've argued this best case is not good enough for the metaphysical claim. Now, a number of authors go even further. They make the claim on behalf of consequentialism even without assuming determinism, and I would question that all the more. Okay, so summarising what we're up to. I submit that the metaphysical foundations of objective consequentialism are dubious. The statement of it may glide easily off the tongue, but when we scrutinise it, I think it falls apart. But suppose my critique is just mistaken, that everything I've said up to now is just wrong. Well, I still submit that objective consequentialism has jaw-dropping metaphysical commitments that have not been previously appreciated. I say we should have done a double, triple, quadruple take at the very statement of it, rather than nodding along with its easy, breezy wording. And only then should we have begun to discuss familiar objections. Again, so much to say, so little time, so much I have to cut out. There's a whole big discussion we could have about so-called counterfactism, and which I'm glad Richard's in the audience, and Ori Stefansson, who we know and love, has written on this about basically this metaphysical issue about whether you get a unique world, you know, out of any old counterfactual antecedent. Big topic. Feel free to talk about it at Q&A. I've got much more to say about other things. I have to move on. Now, generalising the problem. Now, the heart of the problem is objective consequentialism's appeal to facts regarding the long-term consequences of actions that are not performed. Okay, and that's all that matters. But a version of the problem will arise for any theory for which such consequences count for something. So even deontological theories give some moral weight to the consequences of actions. Rawls, on the handout, writes, deontological theories are defined as non-teleological theories, ones, not as views that characterise the rightness of institutions and acts independently from their consequences. All ethical doctrines worth our attention take consequences into account in judging rightness. One which did not would simply be irrational, crazy. Okay, and now to the extent that these are long-term consequences, the problems I've raised for objective consequentialism will kick in. It makes no sense to speak of the consequences of an action that's never performed. I say it's a jaw-dropping metaphysical commitment to appeal to counterfactuals about what the long-term consequences would be if the action were performed. Well, to the extent that deontological theories make such an appeal, their foundations are also suspect. I don't want to overstate that, right? I'm not saying I've brought down all deontological theories. I said it carefully, to the extent that they traffic in these long-term counterfactuals. What I said kicks in. Likewise, virtue ethics must traffic in the consequences of actions to some extent. Hursthouse and Pettigrove, right? It should go without saying that the virtuous are mindful of the consequences of possible actions. How could they fail to be reckless, thoughtless, and short-sighted if they were not? But again, an action that's merely possible does not have consequences at all, and long-term counterfactual consequences are as suspect here as they were before. And consider again the best case for there being a fact of the matter of what would happen were you to act in some non-actual way. That was determinism. And again, we may specify as precisely as we like the details of your hypothetical action, but what would then happen depends on much more than you. It's not just about you. For the rest of history to follow, a snapshot of the entire world at that time is needed, but all we have is a selfie. And again, I don't want to overstate this. To be sure, deontology and virtue ethics are not as beholden to the consequences as consequentialism, but still, given how perilously the consequences may vary depending on the fine details of what you do and what the rest of the world does, even versions of these theories risk foundering. Where do we go from here? We go to the bottle of water. So far, my discussion's been almost entirely critical. Now, how did we get into this predicament? Three moving parts led to the problems for consequentialism. One, it appeals to the highly specific long-term consequences of actions. Two, it understands consequences with counterfactuals. Three, it's objective. So I want to now look at three ways we might improve it. One, appeal to not too specific short-term consequences of actions. Two, understand consequences with objective probabilities, not counterfactuals. Three, understand consequences with subjective or evidential probabilities. I think the first way still fails. The second and third ways are more promising. So quickly, one, not too specific short-term consequences of actions. I found it implausible that there's a fact of the matter of highly specific counterfactual consequences until the end of time. It's more plausible there's a fact of the matter of the not too specific short-term consequences of your action. If you were to help the old lady across the street, she would be significantly happier for the next few minutes. If you were to go to the pub, you would have fun for the next hour or two, and so on. And such claims are straightforward common sense. The serious metaphysical problem that I raised seems to be alleviated. There's no longer a striking mismatch between the strength of the antecedent and that of the consequent. We've greatly weakened the consequent. And while we're at it, the problems of cluelessness and clumsiness seem to be alleviated. Common sense has it that we often know such simple counterfactuals. And it seems that the fine details of how you act don't matter much for the not too specific short-term consequences. You could help the old lady in a myriad of ways and she'd still be happier for the next couple of minutes. You could go to the pub a number of different arrival times and still have fun for the next couple of hours. Clumsy you might be, but it shouldn't matter. The unspecific proximate consequences should turn out much the same. Well, for what it's worth, I think that even such not too specific short-term counterfactuals are false, but that's because of my particular, some might say peculiar, views about counterfactuals, which I have not presupposed for the bulk of this talk. So I think that most counterfactuals are false because of either the chanciness of the consequence or the unspecificity of the antecedents. Pardon the homonyms consequence with a TS and consequence with a CE on the end, and that's an annoying coincidence, but that's another near homonym. Anyway, if you were to help the old lady, she might not be significantly happier for the next few minutes, there's some chance of your offending her or her falling badly or having a heart attack. If you were to go to the pub, somehow or other, you might not have fun for the next hour or two. You might get into a fight with someone. Someone might break bad news to you, what have you. So I think that the requisite counterfactuals are false even on the commonsensical, not too specific, short-term formulation. But now I admit I'm the one with the surprising metaphysical commitments, whereas previously it was clearer that it was the long-term counterfactual consequentialist who had them. Anyway, the respite for objective consequentialism is short-lived. Recall the psychopath. The potential consequences are short-term and maybe rather unspecific. The world would be destroyed somehow or other immediately if the coin landed heads. Business as usual, more or less, if the coin landed tails. So what would happen if the psychopath did his deed? Well, it's not the case that billions of people would die. They might not, each with chance a half. So even short-term, not too specific consequentialism fails to capture the wrongness of the deed. Now this shorter-term version might fare better than the long-term version. It's still untenable. We're up to 2. Understand consequences with objective probabilities. Yeah, I like probabilities. I think they're in better shape than counterfactuals. I prefer to formulate consequentialism in probabilistic terms, as various authors do, Jackson, Graves, others. In particular, the notion of expected value or expectation is probabilistic. And it's on the handout if you need it. In this room, I'm pretty sure most people know it. The value of a given possibility is multiplied by its conditional probability of being realised given an action. The expected value is the sum of such products. In your choice between helping the old lady and going to the pub, the right action is the one that has higher expected value. So we just get rid of the problematic counterfactuals altogether. Now, of course, this shifts the problem of understanding consequences counterfactually to the problem of understanding probabilities. But I say we've got a vast literature on the interpretation of probability to draw on, and in particular we may distinguish objective probabilities, also known as chances, subjective probabilities, also known as credences, and evidential probabilities, also known as degrees of confirmation. Okay, I suggest that objective consequentialism should be formulated in terms of objective probabilities. A morally right action is one that maximizes expected value where the weights are conditional chances at the time of choice. Now, will the problems that I've raised for objective consequentialism reappear when it's stated in terms of objective chances, expectations? No, or not to the same extent. Now, so much to say about this, so little time. Let's go, quickly. Well, what about non-actual actions? I observed that there are no consequences of an action that's not performed, but there are chances of consequences conditional on such an action. And they're actual chances. They're features of the actual world. For example, there are chances at the time of your choice of various consequences given that you go to the pub, even if you do not, in fact, go to the pub. Indeed, most conditional chances have conditions that are not realised. What about the metaphysics? I argued that counterfactual-based consequentialism has jaw-dropping metaphysical commitments on pain of rampant indeterminacy. Chance-based consequentialism, I submit, is in better order. And we have a vast literature on the interpretation of objective probability to draw on. I'm thinking of frequency interpretations, propensity interpretations, best systems, pentaculus, symmetry-based accounts, the method of arbitrary functions, blah, blah, blah. Now, I won't choose among them here. I've expressed some of my preferences elsewhere. I don't like frequentism. Anyway, I'm just pointing out there's much to say philosophically in favour of a commitment to chances, and we're plausibly committed scientifically to them anyway. Statistical mechanics and quantum mechanics are explicitly probabilistic theories. It's natural to understand their probabilities objectively. So far from being suspicious of chances, I think they're indispensable. But in any case, I need only a commitment to comparative chances, one chance being greater than another, and that's less of a commitment than to numerical chances. What about clumsiness? I mean, this is fun. While outcomes are often acutely sensitive to initial conditions, the chances of outcomes are more robust, and the conditional chances are still more robust. If I ask, what's the chance of a coin landing heads? You don't say, ooh, who's tossing the coin? How high? No, the details don't matter. Small variations in your arrival time at the pub will make no difference, or almost no difference, to the conditional chances of latter-day Buddhas or Hitlers. So your clumsiness about your exact arrival time won't matter to these chances, and hence to the corresponding expectations. It's as if God would tell you, don't worry, you can relax when it comes to the comparative conditional chances. It all comes out in the wash. And so it goes for almost all of your choices. Not all of them. Again, we could talk about just how far this goes. I think it goes quite a long way. You might worry that we'll typically be clueless about the requisite chances. Well, first, in virtue of their robustness, we sometimes do know the chances. Again, think of coin tossing. Think of radioactive decay laws. Chances are such powerful theoretical tools largely because of their stability when compared with the outcomes themselves. More often we know a conditional chance. We can use the information in the condition. And above all, much more often we know that inequalities hold between conditional chances. They're more robust still, and hence the inequalities between conditional expectations hold. And the inequalities suffice for determining which action is better than another. Donating to Oxfam is better than going on a serial killing rampage. All right, and the solutions to the problems of clumsiness and cluelessness are closely related. Both turn on the comparative insensitivity of chances to initial conditions, which we're typically unable to precisely fine-tune and of which we're ignorant. And the much greater insensitivity of comparative conditional chances. We can know them, we're not clumsy about them. In any case, I think that the prospects for solving the problem of cluelessness may be better still for subjective consequentialism, and that's what we now will turn to. We're up to 3. Understand consequences with subjective evidential probabilities. Now the obvious move is to replace the objective probabilities with subjective probabilities of the agent in question. That brings us to Jackson's decision-theoretic consequentialism. The morally right action for this agent is the one that maximizes subjective expected value, where the weights are her conditional credences at the time of the choice. So again, non-actual actions are not a problem. The metaphysics of credences is arguably in even better order than that of chances. And it's even clearer than it was for objective expectations that clumsiness is not a problem for subjective expectations. For almost any rational agent, small variations, even large variations, in their exact arrival time in the pub will make no difference to their conditional credences of most subsequent events. For example, latter-day Buddhas or Hitlers being conceived. It will take extraordinary evidence for a rational agent's credences in these possibilities, and hence inequalities among expectations, to be so acutely sensitive to the initial conditions, like the millisecond of the arrival time in the pub. Our credences just don't work like that. I mean, maybe God could provide such evidence, but that would be extraordinary. And so it goes for almost all of your choices. Now, what about the problem of cluelessness for subjective consequentialism? Graves argues that we can solve it to a large extent. I just want to quickly talk about that. And her key move is to appeal to a version of the principle of indifference. One might regard it as a central constraint on evidential probabilities, probabilities that measure evidential support. So roughly, the principle says, if we have no more evidence in favour of one proposition than another, they're evidentially symmetric, then we should assign them equal probabilities. And Graves argues that the principle of indifference solves an important class of cluelessness cases. Roughly, it allows us to cancel out the long-term consequences of one action or another, so we can just focus on the short-term consequences, which are foreseeable. Now, well, in another talk, I rebut this idea at length. You're just going to have to invite me back. But quickly, the cases at issue involve extreme uncertainty regarding the relevant possibilities resulting from our actions. We're in an epistemic fog. Now, if we assigned them equal probability, a la the principle of indifference, then getting just a tiny bit of evidence in favour of one should suddenly break the equality. But that doesn't seem right. The fog doesn't suddenly lift. It remains after slight evidential sweetening of one possibility. Now, maybe you recognise the move I'm making here. It's a little bit like what we see in the literature on incommensurability, okay? You have a choice in Raz's example of pursuing a career in law or as a clarinetist, okay? It's not that one's better than the other, and it's not that they're exactly equally good, and the mark of the latter is slightly sweetening one of the options. A slight pay rise as a lawyer doesn't suddenly make it clear, oh, well, now we're done, I'll be a lawyer. No, you're in this sort of value fog still. And now I'm giving you an epistemic analogue of that. The principle of indifference might be seen as a putative constraint on rational subjective probabilities, which strive to track evidential probabilities. I prefer another constraint. They strive to track objective chances. Now we're on the home straight. So let's talk a bit about the principle, which I hope we all know and love. Given the centrality of objective chances in consequentialism, as I formulated it, it's natural to seek a constraint that's based on chances, and here it is. I'll just read it out. The credence of A, that's the credence of some rational agent, given that the chance of A is X, where that's defined. Okay, the idea is that a rational agent strives to track the corresponding chances with her credences. Okay, now that we have a bridge between chances and rational credences, I can recapitulate some of the points I made earlier about objective expectations, parlay them into corresponding points about credences and subjective expectations. So I said chances of outcomes are less sensitive to initial conditions than the outcomes themselves. Remember the case of tossing the coin? Ooh, who's tossing? No, doesn't matter. So knowing this fact about chances, rational credences and thus rational subjective expectations will correspondingly be less sensitive to initial conditions than the outcomes themselves. Even less sensitive will be conditional credences, and much less sensitive will be comparative conditional credences. One's bigger than another. And thus inequalities between conditional credence weighted expectations. We thus bolster our solution to the problem of clumsiness. And I argued that we can often be almost certain about inequalities between objective expectations. For example, almost certain that the expectation is greater for donating to Oxfam than it is for serial killing or for setting up a probabilistic doomsday device. And rationality requires us to reflect such an inequality in our subjective expectations. So consequentialism says, donate to Oxfam. Far from being clueless, we can know it. Now that said, I admit there are also harder cases, but we already knew that. Sometimes our credences do not yield a determinate verdict about which of our options is best, and subjective consequentialism should recognise that. And we are done. So conclusion, let us just put this all together. Consequentialism reformulated. Objective consequentialism should not speak of the consequences of actions that are not performed, let alone comparisons involving them. I said that was nonsense. Nor should it traffic in counterfactuals about what the consequences of actions would be. That betrays a commitment to a dubious metaphysics. Rather, objective consequentialism should be formulated probabilistically. The objective moral value of an action is the conditional chance-weighted average of the value of its possible consequences. One action is better than another, just in case the former's objective moral value is greater than the latter's. And now just replace the chances by credences, and you get subjective consequentialism. So the distinction between the two kinds of consequentialism neatly follows from the corresponding distinction between two kinds of probabilities, which is already well known in formal epistemology. This brings me back full circle to where I began this talk, formal epistemology. I said that foundational issues in probability and counterfactuals bear crucially on moral philosophy. We've seen that the very formulation of consequentialism, and perhaps of moral theories more generally, bring in their trade a host of such issues. And I've barely begun.